What makes cult classics so endearing? This is a question that I've been asking myself a lot recently, and it's at the very core of why I made this particular video. I wanted to understand the appeal of these stories that go largely unknown or are generally panned at the time of their initial release. What makes people latch on to these stories and identify with them? Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this question, as art is a highly subjective medium, and there are very different reasons why any single movie might become a cult classic compared to another. Hence why I'm choosing to approach this question one film at a time. And that leads us to the subject of today's video, the first film in this Cult Classic Retrospective Series. The Rocketeer, directed by industry special effects veteran Joe Johnston, is a very 90s movie, based on a hit comic series created by illustrator Dave Stevens. The comic is far more adult, which makes it an incredibly odd adaptation choice for Disney. But while the movie sheds a lot of the comic's more mature trappings, it still earnestly tries to capture that elusive 1930s neverwear depicted in old movies and in vintage Art Deco posters, the likes of which were the inspiration for the original panels of the source material. Whether this trade-off was worth it or not is totally up to you. Unfortunately, the differences between the comic book and the movie will have to be the subject for another time, because they aren't really the focus of why I made this video. I made this video because I'm fascinated by the film's loyal fanbase, and although the comic's fanbase factors into that, this film's cult classic status seems to have evolved largely independently from the source material. And although many would consider that unfortunate, it's the reality of the situation. For the purposes of this video, I'm interested in what makes other people happy when watching The Rocketeer. And most importantly, I'm interested in why. Why is The Rocketeer so memorable to people, despite its initial commercial and critical failure? First, I think it's important to note that I'm not sure that the story is the #1 main draw of the film. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. There's certainly a lot of stuff to love. The idea of fulfilling your dreams through flight and having that wish fulfillment is a powerful idea, and the adventure of dodging danger through the skies is a big draw for this film. The concept of a small-town kid accidentally stumbling across something that allows them to become a superhero has massive appeal, otherwise it wouldn't be used so often in the genre. And back in the 30s, a significant amount of pulpy comic book action adventures revolved around fighting Nazis and mob bosses to save the girl you love. This era-specific wish fulfillment is definitely an outdated cliché, but it's an accurate one for the time. However, despite the plot's novelty or the popularity of its superhero structure, I really don't think that's the exact thing that people focus on when thinking about this movie. The plot certainly isn't bad, but it's nothing to write home about either. It's just a pulpy, all-American action adventure, with a young gung-ho hero being caught up in a tangled web of espionage and spies. This type of story certainly ties into the film's appeal, but I also think it's safe to say that it isn't the only factor in it either. I feel like people are enamored with the Rocketeer's atmosphere, and the plot is just a single element of that atmosphere. I personally think part of the Rocketeer's charm, and one of the reasons why a lot of people remember it so fondly, is its nostalgic retrofuturism. Retrofuturism is a loose term used to describe an artistic style that imitates past visions of the future. For instance, this film's retrofuturism concerns what people in the 1920s and 30s thought the future would be like. Which, of course, is not exactly what the future turned out to be, but that might be exactly what some people want. To some people, our own version of the future may seem mundane or even frightening, and so there's comfort in falling back on old visions of what it could have been instead. There's a great deal of imagination that's employed in figuring out what possible futures could have looked like, and there are dozens of permutations of this idea that have become popular over the years in everything from video games to graphic novels. Now, I'm not exactly an art history expert, so feel free to correct me in the comments below. But from what I understand from my research, the particular aesthetic applied to the Rocketeer is inspired by the ideas of a future aligning with the art, architecture, and popular design found throughout the 30s and 40s. This Art Deco style supposedly existed before this in France, but it reached the height of its popularity in America during that time frame, and was heavily featured in popular culture at the time. It found its way into comic books, pulp science fiction, and most memorably, the World's Fairs that took place during the 30s in Chicago and New York. The Rocketeer intentionally has soft themes of this Art Deco retrofuturism woven throughout its story to marvelous effect, and its audience seems to adore that. It's also important to note that this is a surprisingly popular style with certain audiences, and can be found in a variety of other films that were executed with varying success, such as Tim Burton's Batman, Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, and even Joe Johnston's own recent film, Captain America: The First Avenger, though Captain America contains them to a lesser degree. More on that later. But what effect does this Art Deco style have on the appeal of the film? To begin with, it helps reinforce the film's rather nostalgic atmosphere. The Rocketeer has a certain charm that many people, myself included, seem to find irresistible. It's this memory of a past that never was, and yet always will be. It may be extremely rose-colored and romanticized, but considering the horrors of that era that are often depicted in popular media these days, focusing on the positives of that period from time to time can be a refreshing idea. It's a notion that's been presented throughout history by Hollywood, especially in its golden age, and displayed by popular blockbusters like Indiana Jones and old-school MGM musicals. Speaking of Indiana Jones, the director of The Rocketeer, Joe Johnston, won an Oscar for his special effects and design work on that very film years earlier in his career. Because of that experience, it's safe to say that he is intimately familiar with that genre in every way. Back in those days, Johnston was a special effects artist learning his craft from the giants of his day, like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. Because of how he got his start, it would make sense that this artistic, even romanticized mentality and outlook on cinema would be especially meaningful to him. Obviously, this romanticized vision is far from the actual 1930s, the decade of the Great Depression, Prohibition, and skyrocketing organized crime, not to mention the actual Hollywood scene at the time that was hidden under the polished veneer of the films they produced. Rather, The Rocketeer purposefully evokes that fictional 1930s to form a sort of heightened reality, creating something atmospheric rather than one that's grounded in reality. Still, despite some hiccups and out-of-character moments for its protagonist, this film accomplishes what it sets out to do expertly, conjuring up an illusion of a 1930s neverwhere that lives on in the imagination. It's full of Hollywood glamour, the exciting action of pulp magazines, unlikely small-town heroes, and, most importantly for this film, the bright future of the aviation industry. During this era, the optimistic promise of conquering the skies was exemplified in the pioneers and testing grounds of the Southern California Airways, and that made it the perfect pairing for the romanticized glamour of Hollywood's heyday. Speaking of Hollywood's golden age, this movie is almost a loving homage to the stylized glitz and glam found in the films during the 1930s, and a love letter to the action serials that premiered around that time as well. The latter are the very serials that influenced Joe Johnston's earlier work on Indiana Jones. The Rocketeer carries on that tradition in its own unique way. However, lest people think I'm comparing these two films, it's incredibly important to note that I think The Rocketeer isn't anywhere near Indiana Jones in its quality or popularity. Of course, that doesn't mean it's a bad movie either. And even if it's just a mediocre imitation of Indiana Jones's style for a lot of people, it still fits into that same vein and hits a lot of the right retrofuturistic notes for fans of that genre. This in turn provides more content for the 30s flashback fans to engage with, and that is a significant factor for its enduring popularity. There are thousands of individuals out there who love 1930s nostalgia and want to see a lot more of it in cinema. Unfortunately, it's not as prominent as they would like, and so a lot of these fans are always looking for anything they can get their hands on in the same vein, and this movie seems to hit that perfect sweet spot for a lot of them. Not to mention that Joe Johnston himself falls squarely into that fanbase. Some critics may see it as cliché and romanticized, but it's clear that Joe Johnston has a passion for this type of filmmaking, and you can honestly feel that earnestness and passion unfolding on screen. This incredibly authentic joy is somewhat infectious. Even if you think it's silly or outdated, there's no denying that Joe Johnston is at least making something that he cares about. That's a lot more than most Hollywood executives can say about their movies these days. This film's cult classic status indicates that it's scratching a particular itch for those like-minded individuals in the audience. And the existence of that niche explains the success of the somewhat more recent film, Captain America: The First Avenger. That film, also directed by Johnston, is fueled with his signature passion for the romanticized bygone days of the wartime era, and is a more complete execution of his ideas. In many ways, it has a lot of the same pulp aesthetics and themes that are found in The Rocketeer, though slightly updated to fit the 40s rather than the 30s. However, this time, they're sourced from the comic book industry of that era, rather than the film industry, which is ironic because that's exactly what the original Rocketeer comic set out to do in its original run. Still, there's a surprising amount of overlap here, and it shares a lot of the same bones as the Rocketeer. At the very least, they both share the all-American, patriotic, Nazi-fighting young man who's aided in his battle by his endearing inventor friend. However, Captain America executes these tropes better, and reaches a far wider audience than the Rocketeer ever did. In many ways, Captain America owes a lot of its success to the Rocketeer, as it builds upon many of the same themes and aesthetics, as well as the earnestness of its execution. It's the perfected version of what Johnston was trying to do with the Rocketeer. Again, that's not to say the Rocketeer is a bad film. It just means that Johnston had a lot more time to learn from what he had done in the Rocketeer and refine that formula as much as possible. Regardless of its permutations and predecessors, the Rocketeer has endured. And at the end of the day, there are probably even more reasons why this film has gained an audience over the years that I failed to mention here. However, I do think that its art style, its unfailing optimism, its sincerity for hopeful themes, and the sheer earnestness with which these themes are executed provides some of the most memorable reasons for its retroactive success. I meet a surprising amount of people who look back at this film fondly after all these years for these very factors. And after considering these details, I honestly can't blame them. Even if this movie isn't really for you, there's no denying that it is for someone. In addition, it's clear that The Rocketeer was made with the utmost sincerity, from a man who truly believed in what he was doing. And for the people who are out there that love the same things as him, that's enough. That's what cult classics embody, the sense of making art for the sake of art. To craft something that you and other people who are like you can care about. In the eyes of its fans, it doesn't matter if everyone else hates it, because it's something that makes them happy and gives them something to connect to. And I have always admired the people who like what they like because they like it, in spite of all the opposing voices around them, because that is true enjoyment. The result of The Rocketeer's sincerity is a feel-good flick that exists in a time where good feelings seem to be few and far between. And in such a frightening era, when the whole world seems like it will come crashing down at any minute, there's a lot of value in making something that lets its audience's imagination soar.
We hope you've enjoyed our program. Tune in next week to hear more high-flying adventures. You've been listening to the Magic Masterpiece Theater. It is January the 27th, 1938. It's 5:15 here in New York, and an unexpected 60 degrees. There is a heat wave coming through to last until Saturday evening. Up next, we expect to hear from the Prime Minister of Britain over the state of affairs overseas and how it will impact trade in the United States. Thank you for listening.